In the summer of 1914, the world felt modern and prosperous. For many, it felt like a lasting peace, but underneath this glittering surface, a web of alliances, ambitions, and old grudges had turned Europe into a powder keg. All it needed was a single spark. This is the story of that spark, and how it ignited a fire that would consume the globe, topple empires, introduce the world to horrors of industrial warfare, and leave a permanent scar on humanity. This is the timeline of the war that was supposed to end all wars. Our story begins not in some grand hall of power, but on a street's corner in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. The date is 28th of June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire, is visiting the city with his wife. The province had been formally annexed by the empire 6 years earlier in 1908, a move that enraged Serbian nationalists who dreamed of a unified South Slav state. That morning, a team of assassins positioned themselves along the Archduke's motorcade route. They were part of a group called Young Bosnia, trained and armed by a shadowy Serbian secret society known as the Black Hand. The first attempt failed. A bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and injured people in the vehicle behind. Shaken but determined, the Archduke continued his day. But then fate took a cruel and tragic turn. After a speech at the town hall, the royal procession made a wrong turn. As the driver tried to reverse, the car stalled. By sheer awful coincidence, it stopped directly in front of one of the conspirators, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The heir to the throne and his wife were dead. Few could have grasped the magnitude of what had just happened, but this single act was the spark. It triggered the July crisis, a roughly 5-week diplomatic meltdown that would drag the world into war. For decades, the great powers of Europe had been tangled in a complex web of mutual defence pacts. On one side was the Triple Entente, France, Russia and Great Britain. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. This system, meant to keep the peace through a balance of power, instead created a rigid path to war. It was a line of dominoes, just waiting for the first one to fall. Austria-Hungary, convinced Serbia was behind the assassination, saw its chance to crush Serbian nationalists. On 23rd of July, backed by its powerful ally Germany, they issued an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so harsh it was designed to be rejected. When Serbia, as expected, refused to accept all the terms, the first domino fell. On 28th of July 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The chain reaction had begun. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic Serbs, started mobilising its massive army. Germany saw this as a direct threat and on 1st of August declared war on Russia. Bound by its own treaty, France began to mobilise. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France. Germany's strategy for a 2-front war was a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan. It called for a lightning-fast invasion of France through neutral Belgium, aiming to knock the French out of the war before turning to face the slow mobilising Russians. But invading Belgium triggered the final domino. Great Britain had long guaranteed Belgian neutrality. On 4th of August, after Germany ignored Britain's ultimatum to withdraw, Britain declared war. The continent was now locked on a collision course. But what about Italy? Despite being in the Triple Alliance, Italy declared neutrality, arguing the alliance was defensive and its partners had been the aggressors. A year later, in 1915, Italy would enter the war on the side of the Allies. The opening months were a blur of motion. The German army smashed into Belgium, while the French launched their own Plan 17 into the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine, only to be thrown back with devastating losses. A small but professional British force arrived in France to help stem the German tide. The German advance seemed unstoppable until it reached the Marne River, just outside Paris, in a desperate stand that became known as the First Battle of the Marne. French and British forces managed to halt the invasion. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. There would be no quick victory. Both armies then engaged in a race to the sea, each trying to outflank the other. As they went, they dug in. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a vast network of trenches began to scar the landscape. A bloody stalemate was setting in. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russian armies invaded Germany and Austria-Hungary, opening a vast and brutal theatre of war. The world was settling in for a long, grinding conflict. By 1915, the Western Front had become a static line of hellish fortifications. This was a new kind of fighting, defined by defensive firepower. The machine gun could now mow down attacking infantry in waves. The battlefield between the trenches known as No Man's Land was a churned-up moonscape of mud, craters and tangled barbed wire. Life for the soldier was miserable. Mud, rats, lice and a constant threat of death. Days of dreadful boredom were punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The primary tactic became the artillery barrage, when millions of shells would be fired to soften up the enemy, followed by a whistle and the order to go over the top. These assaults were often slaughters. However, tactics did evolve beyond simple human waves, with armies developing creeping barrages and infiltration techniques. Though the cost remained horrific. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 was a 10-month ordeal of attrition that caused over 700,000 casualties. To relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, the British and their allies launched the Battle of the Somme. On its very first day, the British army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. By the time it ended, the battle had cost over 1 million casualties on all sides for a gain of just a few miles. Battles like Passchendaele in 1917 became infamous for their horrific conditions, where torrential rain turned the battlefield into a swamp of mud that could swallow men and horses. This was the reality of the Great War, industrial-scale killing for infinitesimal gains. World War I was a gruesome laboratory for military innovation, as nations scrambled for a way to break the trench stalemate. In 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans unleashed a terrifying new weapon on a large scale: poison gas. Chlorine and later phosgene and mustard gas would choke, blind and burn soldiers, adding a new psychological horror to the war. To counter barbed wire and machine guns, the British introduced the tank in 1916. Early models were slow and unreliable, but they were the first step toward modern armoured warfare. Aircraft at first used for reconnaissance were soon armed, leading to the dramatic dogfight of flying aces. They were also used for bombing, escalating the threat to civilians in a way that, while not entirely new, was unprecedented in scale. Beneath the waves, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. While submarines weren't new, their use in a sustained campaign to sink Allied shipping was. This deadly naval threat aimed to starve Britain into submission, but would it ultimately play a decisive role in bringing another global power into the war? For 3 years, the great powers had ground each other down. By 1917, however, the stalemate was about to be shattered. First, in Russia, the war had bled the nation dry. In March, revolution erupted and Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power, promising peace, land and bread. They delivered on the first part by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, officially taking Russia out of the war. This freed up hundreds of thousands of German soldiers for the Western Front. But just as Russia was leaving the war, a new giant was entering. The United States had tried to remain neutral, but Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which led to American deaths, enraged the public. Other factors included deep economic ties to the Allies and the final straw, the Zimmermann Telegram, an intercepted message in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the US. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. While it would take time for American troops to arrive in force, the country's industrial might and manpower would decisively tip the balance. World War I was the death knell for the old world order. The immense strain of total war shattered 4 of the world's great empires. The Russian Empire was the first to go in 1917, consumed by revolution and civil war. In 1918, the Central Powers crumbled from within. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the very power that started the war, dissolved as its many ethnic groups declared their independence. The Ottoman Empire, often called the sick man of Europe, collapsed after a string of defeats in the Middle East, its territories partitioned by the victorious Allies. Finally, in Germany, with its army in retreat and its people starving, revolution broke out. On 9th of November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled, bringing an end to the German Empire. Several major dynasties had collapsed, but monarchy was not entirely wiped from the map, as it persisted in countries like the UK, Italy and Spain. Still, the political face of Europe was redrawn forever. With Russia out, Germany launched a massive final gamble in the spring of 1918. The Spring Offensive. Using new stormtrooper tactics, they made huge gains, hoping to break the Allied lines before the Americans arrived in large numbers. The Allies bent but didn't break. With the help of fresh American troops, they launched their own counterattack. This final campaign, the 100 Days Offensive, saw the Allies use coordinated attacks with infantry, artillery tanks and aircraft to systematically push the exhausted German army back. By autumn, the German High Command knew the war was lost. The Allies were collapsing and the home front was in revolt. Germany asked for an end to the fighting. At 5 a.m. on 11th of November 1918, in a railway carriage in France, German representatives signed the armistice. The terms were harsh, demanding evacuation of occupied territories and the surrender of vast amounts of military equipment. The ceasefire took effect at 11 a.m. on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. After 4 years of unimaginable slaughter that mobilised 70 million people and killed over 9 million soldiers, the Great War was over. But the peace was yet to be won. In 1919, the victorious leaders met in Paris. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But instead of laying a foundation for lasting peace, it became a source of deep resentment. The treaty was seen as brutally punitive, especially in Germany. Article 231, which became known as the War Guilt Clause, required Germany to accept responsibility for the war and all its damages. This provided the legal basis for the crippling financial reparations that followed. Germany's military was severely restricted, its army capped at 100,000 men, and it was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. It lost 13% of its territory, including the important industrial region of Alsace-Lorraine and all of its overseas colonies. For many Germans who were reeling from the suddenness of the defeat after years of propaganda, this came as a profound shock. They didn't see the treaty as a peace, but as a diktat, a dictated peace. The shame and economic ruin it caused created fertile ground for political extremism, even as some in Germany began a clandestine rearmament. The shame and economic ruin it caused created fertile ground for political extremism, even as some in Germany began a clandestine rearmament. The Great War left a scar on the soul of the 20th century. It cost the lives of a generation, shattered empires, and introduced the world to industrial-scale slaughter. The war that was meant to end all wars did nothing of the sort. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, instead planted seeds for an even greater conflict. The War Guilt Clause, crushing reparations and national humiliation, was skillfully exploited by radical figures like Adolf Hitler, who promised to tear up the treaty and restore Germany's pride. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, proved powerless in the face of rising aggression. Many historians argue that the Armistice of 1918 wasn't the end of a war, but merely the beginning of a 20-year truce. While not inevitable, the unresolved anger and instability left by the Great War would directly fuel the rise of totalitarianism and ultimately set the stage for a Second World War that would be even more catastrophic. So make sure you subscribe to hear what happened next. And I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.